Good afternoon, viewers. I'm Archana Pai Kulkarni, and I welcome you to She the People TV's Feminist Poetry Festival. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's panel discussion is for all of us who aspire to write poetry, but are totally lost about where to begin, and also for those who have been dabbling in poetry and desire to hone their craft. I take great pleasure in welcoming Pervin Saket and Rochelle Potkar to join this panel discussion. The title, of course, is The Poet's Starter Kit. Let me take you through a short introduction. Pervin Saket was awarded the Srinivas Raipol Poetry Prize 2021 and was the inaugural fellow for the Vancouver Manuscript Intensive 2021. Her poems, including the collection A Tinge of Turmeric, have been widely anthologized in national and international journals. Her novel Urmila has been adapted for the stage, featuring classical Indian dance forms of Kathak, Bharatnatyam, and Odissi. Pervin co-founded the Dampuk Writers' Workshop and is the poetry editor at the Bombay Literary Magazine. Rochelle Potkar, fictionist, poet, critic, curator, editor, translator, screenwriter. Rochelle Potkar is the author of 4 Degrees of Separation, Paper Asylum, and Bombay Hangovers. She has conducted several creative writing workshops across colleges in India and Bangladesh. An alumna of Iowa's International Writing Program and a Charles Wallace Fellow, she was invited into 2019 as a creative writing mentor for Iowa's Summer Institute. She conducts regular poetry workshops with an emphasis on haiku, haibun, and free verse at the Himalayan Writing Retreat. Pervin and Rochelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Pervin, may I begin with you? People are sort of a little scared of poetry, okay? And they don't think they can write a poem. So I want to know whether anyone can write a poem. And do you need a particular kind of sensibility to be able to do so?
That's a really good question, Archana. Thank you for bringing that up. And it is something that we grapple with, especially because I work in a space of literary magazines that can anyone write, and who has access, and who are the gatekeepers to these art forms. So I find that just like, everyone should sing. You don't have to be a professional singer to sing. Everyone should dance. These joys, these arts are available to all of us. And I think poetry is available to all of us. But for those of us who want to transition and want to do something that is more than self-expression, that is more than for our own personal pleasure, then in those cases, we would like a sensibility that is informed by reading, that is informed by an awareness of art, the place of art in current modern thought, that comes from an interaction with contemporaries, with peers, and an involvement in the scene in a manner that is greater than a reader would have. So I think it is certainly accessible to everyone, but we can choose our degrees of involvement, of intimacy, and the ways in which we develop these relationships with words, with poetry, with the page. Yes.
Oh, that's
and yes, we
wonderful
do.
to know. That's heartening.
Yes,
Do you
of course.
remember the first, I know it must be very long ago, but do you remember the first time you wrote your poem? How was the experience like? And what drove you to write it?
I remember one of the first times I've written a poem, which was when I was in school. I was a child, and it was very heartening and very you get that tingly feeling at the edge of your fingertips, because you have, that there's something here. There's some energy between you and the page, and it all of this is only possible because of who I had as an English teacher, and I owe a lot to her. And she brought Mrs. Wadia. She brought a certain, she was so in love with language and with words that she was able to just transfer it to all of us. I remember she would tell us to shut our books, and she would just say, just listen to me. And she would read. And as she read, we felt like we were being transformed to a different place. And I think that kind of, when you see someone in love with something, it transfers to you a little bit. So it was this relationship that was nurtured by my teacher, and then you feel a, a bit of that in your personal practice when you start working, and you feel like that the pen, the curve of the E, there's a certain just the physicality of it. There's a joy in that. And yes, I remember those days because they were instrumental in making all of this possible today.
How wonderful.
How wonderful.
Rochelle, how were you drawn to poetry? In fact, do you remember a kind of aha moment, when you read a poem which appealed to you and you felt that this is what I want to do and I want to write?
Yeah, so listening to Pervin, I feel wow, what a very different milieu she comes from. Because I don't like I was, of course, acquainted with poetry in school, but then I had this long opaque season of being a commerce grad and doing my MBA in marketing, postgrad in advertising, where we didn't have poetry at all. And after that, when poetry came to me, it was a very kind of accidental way in which I was, because I was a short story writer trying to find my way in the literary scene. I was thinking where to start from, and I used to go to all book launches, film festivals, anything that came my way. So poetry came to me very randomly and rowdily, because I would attend some book launches and I would think, okay, and I used to watch poets from a distance because I never thought I was going to be a poet. It was always like, okay, they said something, it is fleeting, they read it beautifully, and they're gone. What is happening? Okay, very interesting. I never thought I was going to be a poet. I've always thought I was a short story writer. So when I started, my first poem was very accidental, that all my first poetry was saved as residues of short stories, lyrical lines, all of them untitled. Untitled document 1, untitled document 2. I didn't think I was a poet at all. So it's the first poem that really made me a poet, that I could say I'm a poet, was the one that got shortlisted at a competition, that is Red Leaf India
Oh,
Award in 2013. And that was the first time I accepted that I might be a poet. And that was an accidental discovery. And I went through all my untitled files because there was so much of random lyrical lines there. And they were all of them were residues of stories I was writing. We have sometimes these extra cacophony or noise, that you're writing something else, and then there's this additional voice that's saying something, and you're like, shh. So all those first poems were just, shh, let me
oh,
write. So, let me just save you here.
oh,
So that's how
how
I came to poetry. Yeah,
how wonderful, how wonderful.
yeah, yeah.
Pervin, okay, suppose I want to write a poem, but I just don't know where to begin. So where does one discover new material? And I've read that you must start small. And do you agree with this? And please give me an example of this. How do you start? Where do you begin?
Where do you begin? Yes, um, I will not be able to speak for everyone, but I can tell you how I tend to start my poems. And usually it begins with reading another poem. When I'm reading something that has moved me, there's a part of me that wants to transcend that experience and move to the other side. And reading something that is truly, in some way, powerful. Uh, it could be a very gentle, powerful, but you see that it's no longer black ink marks. It has the symbols mean something, and have connected to another human being. When I read something like that, that's usually a starting point for me. And as for starting small and going big, my journey, and I find that for most poets, the journey is the reverse. In the sense, we first begin with these big ideas, big themes. We want to talk about violence, we want to talk about injustice, we want to talk about um, changing the world, climate, things like that. And I find that later we move towards ge- I, I think initially, at least, my work was noisier. That's the way I'll describe it. And later, I found that I was more interested in the small things which represented the big stuff rather than directly talking about the big stuff. So, for me, and for many new poets that I see, the journey tends to be reverse. We come from a space of having these important things to say, and we take a little time to find out that the way to access those is perhaps with the smaller stuff. So I push when I'm talking to emerging poets, to new writers, enthusiastic poets. I tell them, yes, say all the grand stuff, but say it in the way in which it affects the smallest person you know, the smallest moment you know. Access the grand stuff through the particular, through the specific, through the personal. And that relationship then becomes something that is more meaningful than a statement, which is how we tend to start off with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Rochelle, do you think poetic language is different? Where do you find the words? Do you have to build a word bank, a different poetic vocabulary? If so, how do you do it?
So initially, when I came to poetry, of course, I didn't read much. But once I started enjoying the process of expressing, and focusing on poetry, I started reading a lot of international poetry. And the beauty about it is that because English is practiced in its poetic
Hmm.
forms across the world, you get to see, how everything is expressed, from a simple theme like love to something very, very, very complex and layered like uh, political history. So I could read a lot to understand my voice. So I think I also unearthed my voice as I went along. I also unearthed my worldview as I went along. And when you read a lot, that's, I think, the best way to reservoir, because I think somewhere, as writers, I was always a magpie, like many are, that we love these new words. And I even have a theory that I teach in my workshops, which I've come to believe in so much, that I think each word has a quantum physics in it. Okay, because if you look at a word, especially for haiku, the way you weigh words is like a goldsmith is weighing gold. So I went to see what does a word have, and I found it has so much in it, not just because it is from the thesaurus, which always amuse myself with for every day for 5 minutes, but like a word can have pace, depth in it, gravity, mood, music, song, imagery. It can even have tentative space where you bring the reader in. There's even color, there's time in it, and there's even the resonance of what words come before it and what words come after.
Hmm,
So
hmm, hmm.
actually, I feel a word is a story. One word has so much of quantum physics in it. So I think, once you start getting magnetized to it, you start collating it, and it just forms into your reservoir. And when you want to express, it's there for you. This is the wet clay or the raw material, which is just there. So I think reading definitely helps, and also uh, writing in a way that, and editing in a way that you come closest to what you want to say. So there is a lot about how you find your voice. And you find your voice sometimes by just writing and writing until the water runs clear, and you come closest to it, maybe a bit of editing, but you come closest to that original voice of yours. And then you have reached, actually.
Yes. You speak about reading a lot, but
Mhm.
how does a beginner choose what to read? So how do you direct your reading? I mean, it's fine that
Mhm.
you say read, but what do I read? And
Yeah.
which poets were you drawn to in your initial writing years?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, when we talk of beginners in workshops or beginners, I've noticed that the beginners themselves vary. Okay, there are some beginners who are very mature and they're almost there, 90% they're there, and you just need to nudge them. And there are some beginners who actually have not read. So it's more related to those. I feel, I feel in my journey as a poet, there was a time when I had a lot to say. I didn't need to read. There was a
Hmm.
lot that I had read. Probably I had read people, I had read their faces, I had watched the world from my window, or I had socially observed, and I had a lot to say. So then I didn't need to read. But there was a time I was very thirsty. So how do you direct reading? Now, what I like is the fact that there's so many varieties of poetry. Poetry is like a bird song. Each
Hmm.
bird has a different song. So for a new reader of poetry, they need to go about trying to find where the resonance is. Okay, because
Oh,
there's so much of poetry out there, good poetry, that how do you decide whether you like this or you like that? So I feel you should read a lot, and you will find your resonance in some places more than in not. Also, I advise those poets, the new poets,
hmm.
that if you don't like something because you can't find it accessible right now, wait, keep the book away. Don't give it away. Keep the book. 3 years later, that those
Hmm.
that poetry make perfect sense,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
you would have evolved. Because we keep evolving every single day. That our life, the self relationships with ourselves and with our art keeps evolving. So what you didn't understand today, you will understand three years later very deeply. So I feel somewhere between the reading and the resonance, there's also something like poetry is like light and sound. You can't see all light, you can't hear all sound. But if you evolve in perception, you will be able to perceive more and more. You have to give, poetry needs patience.
Wonderful. Pervin, do you also agree that the craft of poetry can be taught and that a poem is the best teacher? And I would also want to know who were the poets that impacted you the most. What did you
Sure.
read?
Sure. About can poetry be taught? I would rather rephrase it as can the craft of poetry be learned?
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
because teaching is something that we can debate about, but learning is something that happens all the time, and it happens in subtler ways than we realize. So I certainly think that the craft of poetry can be learned. Now, it can be in a formal setup like a workshop. It could be a sort of self taught process through a lot of reading, and through not just reading poems but reading books about poetry. It could be a combination of the two. It could be like Rochelle did, to just immerse yourself in the environment, be around poets, be around books, be around events, and imbibe some of that energy. It could be in a combination of ways, but certainly it can be learned. And I have I'm indebted to the poets I read growing up, because of the ways in which they got me excited about language. It I find that I have an ambivalent relationship with some of the books we might have read as a child, because our perspectives change, our sensibilities change, but the passion of the writers and the ability to transfer some of that love and playfulness of language is something that I hold very dear. And uh, we read the Great White Dead Men, the way all students do in school. And later on, I found myself drawn towards different kinds of voices, voices from women writers, voices in translation, voices from South Asian writers. And I would encourage poets to look beyond the classics, look beyond the textbook poets that are prescribed to us, and like Rochelle said, to find those voices which resonate with us. Even today, I have subscribed to about 7 or 8 places which send me poems of the day. Or I get poetry newsletters. I get updates from various forums, and the way our world is hyperlinked, one thing leads to another, and in this process, I'm able to identify the themes, the voices, the poets that work for me, that move me, or that I want to follow more closely. So we have all of this at our fingertips today. So I would say, yes, do find these groups, find newsletters, and right from, I mean, Poetry Foundation to Lit Hub to magazines closer to home, look them up. And yeah, initially, one thing I did is, if I found a poet I liked, I would look at their bio note, the one that uh, you read out for us in the beginning, Arjuna, and I would see where else have they been published, and go to those places, and then see who else is published there. Then, like someone over there, look at their bio note, and that way find out about more magazines, more outlets, more publications, more voices. So yes, we have all of this whole wonderful network available to us today. And I don't want to suggest that my reading list will match your reading list, but this is the way in which you will be able to curate your own kind of friendships with poets.
And there are a lot of resources, I've realized. And Pervin, you were the inaugural fellow for the Vancouver Manuscript Intensive 2021. And in fact, you've been writing poetry for years now. So, in what way did this mentorship program enrich your work? Would you recommend it to budding, aspiring poets?
Poets. Absolutely, yes. The VMI fellowship made all the difference. Uh, One is that this was a fellowship specifically for a manuscript in progress. So it was not for poets who haven't yet put together some version of a manuscript. So this helped me, take the manuscript to a level where I was able to identify the ways in which I could strengthen individual poems, but also ways in which poems can speak to each other, develop relationships with each other, and macro aspects of the manuscript, including structuring, choosing placements, choosing. Sometimes a poem can be very strong, but it need not belong to that book. It need not speak to that book. And sometimes a poem by itself may appear to be bland, but placed as neighbors with another poem, it now has different resonances. So these were the ways in which I was able to, move outside that very narrow specificity of lines and verses towards something a little broader, and able to see these relationships. And so certainly, and my mentor, Ellie Kralji Gardner, she's a wonderful poet and teacher and editor. And I think opportunities like these are really, I'm very grateful for them. And I think there should be more of them, especially in India. We have so many exciting voices, and we don't have enough mentorship programs. And I hope that that's going to change in the next few years. Yes.
Thank you, Pervin. Rochelle, you also are an alumna of the University of Iowa's International Writing Program. In fact, how does workshopping your work help? And in what way did that stint impact your work?
So actually, Archana, the IWP, is sometimes confused with the Iowa Writers Workshop. So this was
Okay.
not a writers workshop, but this was where 35 poets and writers in that year, 2015, were invited to share their works published and works in progress. So
Okay.
that was a beautiful confluence, because sometimes even in the common room, you actually shared all your whisperings and murmurings from every corner of the world, and the whole world confluenced in a common room or in one small coffee shop. And Iowa in itself is a planet. It doesn't seem to belong to this world because it's so different that even its manholes and benches have engravings of proverbs and sayings. Okay, so I've never seen a manhole this celebrated, a manhole lid this celebrated. So, but I think for me as a writer, it inscribed unprecedented levels of conviction and confidence, which is very important as the blood of creation, because a lot of times we are not sure as new writers as to where we stand. Are we doing it right? Is this, is that? There are a lot of self doubts. Some doubts are necessary to push you further, but sometimes they can be crippling. So in my case, because Iowa happened at the right time, it gave me that confidence that I may not need too much of external validation. Like I'm okay if I don't get it because I have it, I'm tanked up. But let me talk about workshops. I feel workshops are important if you don't have the time as a new poet. You want to pursue something, you need guidance, and you need it quick. Because what do workshops do sometimes is that besides your self learning, it allows objectivity. And I think objectivity is the most important, relationship we have with distance and time with our art. What does objectivity do? Either you can keep your work away and after time intervals come to edit it in drafts, or you ask someone else who you trust to give you constructive critique. So workshops do allow the conversation to start. I don't think that we, like Pervin said, we need to have much more of these residencies and retreats and programs wherein you could nurture a poet from one poem to the whole manuscript perhaps, or publishing. We don't have that, but little workshops, they do guide you in a limited period of time, and they start conversations. We try to have the new poets start a journey which they shouldn't stop. Like, you try to inculcate that whole dincharya, that read a
Mhm.
little, write a little, edit a little, keep reading even if you're busy, keep reviewing, because I think the reviewing culture in poetry also needs to be very developed, because the culture is not only with creation and production and publication, but it's also in the celebration of things that come out.
Thank you, Rochelle. Um, Pervin, you also conduct a lot of poetry workshops. So, in your opinion, what do beginners struggle with the most? And what can we find in a workshop like yours? What do you take the aspiring writers through? And what would be their takeaways at the end of the workshop?
Yes, beginners, yes, they do need some guidance on craft for sure. But I think the more intangible thing that beginners struggle with is their sense of belonging, their sense of space and connection with the world of literature. Um, like Rochelle said, she comes from a different background, commerce, MBA, and because writers do not necessarily come from these backgrounds, one of the things that they suffer from is a lack of certainty with respect to their space in this world and their relationship with words. And what a workshop can do is to show you in a very tangible way that you belong, that your perspective matters, that you do not have to
Yes.
come from
Yes.
a space of literature or studying languages in order to create something meaningful with words, and that you are enough, that there are resources available for you, that we will find a way to reduce the gatekeepers so that your readers can find you. I think it is these emotional aspects of the writing process that a workshop can also address, in addition to craft. And craft wise, yes, writers, we tend to have a hangover of the kind of text that we have grown up reading. So, so our stories or our poems can be more old-fashioned than we realize. So that is
Mhm.
one thing to be alert for. The other is that when writers do not have, they've not been reading contemporary work, they may think that they have done something very experimental, that they've done something really unique or radical. But then when they come to a workshop, they'll see, oh, okay, in the 70s, this was already done. In 1982, this person did this. So they get a sense of the tradition that they are working with. And they get a sense of where that tradition is today and how they can build upon that in their own work. So in that sense, of that larger sense of your space in this field, and how, where it is so far, how you can contribute, how you can form these associations, these are the subtler things that a workshop can provide, in addition to the nuts and bolts of writing.
But there are these elements like, form, structure, shape. So can a beginner write a poem without any knowledge of these?
We can, yes, we can write all kinds of poems, but it may not be the most effective poem. It may not be the most powerful way to say what you want to say. So for instance, you may want to write a poem about loneliness, and you're writing it in the traditional rhyming scheme that we've grown up reading. Now, rhyme has a certain belongingness, right? A word has a relationship, a sound relationship with another word. Sun will rhyme with run, and there's a relationship. So, if you're writing a poem about loneliness, you might find that it's actually better to have a more scattered language, to move away from these pairs, because that is inconsistent with your theme. You may even find that it's better to write a poem about loneliness with spaces and gaps between words rather than the conventional form. So if a poet is aware of these possibilities of form, then they may be able to match their message and their method. They may be able to match their theme and the way in which they structure that theme. So certainly we can write at all stages, and but I would suggest for beginning writers, and I do it myself, to be open to new forms, new possibilities, to practice, to have your own personal riyaz, where you are just playing. You may not use that, but you're playing with possibilities in your various drafts. Thank you.
In fact, you mentioned sound. So I want to know, how do you train the ear to understand and appreciate sound and rhythm?
Yes, I love working with sound because it's one of the ways in which I can transcend meaning. Meaning, I find, is a very limited relationship with language, and a sound can be much more evocative. And I do read work that is a little loose in its meaning. It's not that important, but it is working with sound. Another thing I love to do is to listen to songs in languages I don't know. So if you're listening to a song in a language that you can't understand, then you are automatically moving towards the sound elements, and your brain can relax with respect to the meaning. So I find that these and I don't do this as a poet, or to I do it for pure enjoyment and pleasure. But these are the ways in which you might uh, have an orientation towards sound, and then find a way to match it with meaning.
Beautiful. In fact, Rochelle, Pervin just spoke about Riyaz. So I want to know that, do prompts help? And where do you find them if they do? And does this kind of Riyaz, I mean, using prompts to write, especially on days when you have no fresh ideas, do you think this hones an aspiring poet's craft?
Yeah. So, of course, I just want to add to Pervin's sound, the how she looks at sound is that sometimes when I don't understand the language of poetry and there is a different language, That's sound poetry for me. Many a times we come across languages we don't understand, if, and there's no translation in English. Okay, but coming back to this question, Archana, I feel that it is a little broader than prompts, because I'll tell you something. I found that the journey of poetry is a journey of self-realizations. Okay, because it's such a personal journey eventually. What Pervin
Mm-hmm.
said about the wide coming to the narrow, or the general coming to the specific, I
Mm-hmm.
also feel that because this is a journey of self realizations, it's a long journey and it's a never ending journey. So prompts or triggers, it could be said you may need them as an impetus at a workshop, or maybe as an exercise, or those nano remos that happen. But actually speaking, the prompts and triggers come from your life, because if poetry is supposed to be that integral and instinctive, we don't need a prompt. The prompt is your life. Things are happening around you. In fact, in Haibun we have something like the epiphany, wherein you write a narrative around the epiphany. Now the epiphany is not something that comes from somewhere. It is what you realize at 3 a.m. this morning, or what you realize as a human being every single day, either with yourself, or in relationship with life, or with another person. So what disturbs you, what makes you smile, what perturbs you, everything, the good, bad, and everything in between. So I feel that prompts are fine, but they are very technical in the sense of their limitedness, because every self-realization can be actually be woven into a line of poetry or an entire poem. So this
Wonderful.
entire journey is that, you know.
We lost about, I think, 5 minutes, because of all these internet disturbances. But I'd like just we have about 3 or 4 minutes. So may I request you to give me really short answers? But we need to. So Rochelle, what are the tools that you would recommend to complete a poem? I've begun a poem and
Mhm.
I want to complete it. So what distancing? What is it that I
So
need to use to
okay,
complete that?
yeah, so the tools were the first thing is that when you incept the story, okay, and I would give it some incubation time, so that before I write it on the page, because sometimes I get the first lines and I want to quickly dash it on a page. Hold back, just let the poem complete itself as much as it
Mhm.
can, and you allow that time, and then you write it. So you have to know, every poet has to know when they start writing the first draft. Don't write, if you write it beforehand, you lose something.
Mhm.
If you wait too long, it gets stale. There is that exact time when from the mind it needs to come on the page. So I feel that's
Mhm.
the first thing. A poem is like a whole exhalation, so you need to exhale that completely in a forgivable first draft, and then the tool is that you edit it in the subsequent drafts. So that exhalation has to be complete, and that comes from inception and incubation. That's the biggest tool.
And you
I mean,
use
after
the
the
word
readings, okay?
forgivable.
Yes,
I use the
forgivable.
use forgivable because you
Yes.
need to. Okay. And Pervin, is it true that many of the ideas that you might express in a novel or a short story or an essay can also come out in a poem?
I'm sure they can. In fact, my novel Urmila began as a short story. Then I found that that was not enough, and I wanted to stay with her longer, and it became a novel. And then once it became a novel, it got adapted for this stage, and for that I created a poem on which the dancers danced. So it went through all these three different forms. So I'm sure that an idea can work in different forms, but the way it works is different. What you can express in a poem with the same idea will be different from what you can express in a novel. A poem can help you stay with a moment for longer. A novel will move along with plot and story. In fact, our films are perhaps the best example, because you'll notice that in movies the story moves on, and then the song takes place, and the song kind of freezes the story, and the song suspends all the realism of the story. People are wearing coordinated outfits and they are dancing in this synchronized manner, and it's zooming in onto the emotion of the character at that time. So I think these are the ways in which a longer narrative like a novel can work versus the way a poem may work with the same story or the same idea.
Wow. If I ask you to name 5 essential tools for a beginner's poetry writing kit, what would they be? I want both of you to
Mm.
take the question, and that is going to be the last question for the day. Uh,
Okay, so I
Do
would
you want to
say
go first, Rochelle?
reading quality poetry, number one. Writing forgivable first drafts. That means you put your critic and editor to sleep. Then editing a poem when it calls out to you. Don't go to edit a poem unless it's under deadline. Let the poem call out to you. That means it's ready to be engaged with. Submitting plenty and accepting rejections with a smile, that it's one more chance to improve your work. Don't look at it as an emotional loss but a gain. And the last is celebrating tiny little milestones. I think we've forgotten to celebrate tiny milestones.
this is wonderful. Pervin, please add to this.
Yes, yes. I would say first is develop a friendship with the word no. Learn to say no. Learn to say no to things that impose on your time, impose on your attention in ways that you don't want. Because poetry is something that is that has very few rewards, except for the process of writing it. We're not going to make a lot of money. We're not going to necessarily move on to some international acclaim. So protect that space, because things, practical life will come in the way. So learn to say no. That would be one. Another would be to develop forgiveness, like Rochelle said, forgiveness for yourself, because you're always going to look back and think, I didn't do this well enough. And that only means that you've changed and you've grown today. So that's just part of the process. Read a lot of poems, and read even poems that don't work or don't make sense for you, because you'll get to know what kind of world of poetry you're navigating. Then I would also suggest, yes, editing, because many people think that it's this spontaneous overflow of emotion, but they forget that Wordsworth completed that line by saying it's the spontaneous overflow of emotion recollected at tranquility. That aspect of recollected at tranquility is the aspect of distance and craft and working on it again, and being able to see whether it's actually doing what it intended to do. So yes, all of these, and Rochelle's very helpful suggestion of send your work out, send your work to editors, send your work to friends, develop a community of sorts, a community of peers, and encourage other poets, encourage your friends. If you read a good poem, find a way to connect to the poet on social media, write to them, and develop a relationship that is bigger than about your specific poem and you, right?
Beautiful. On
All the
that
best.
note, I have to end this session. Thank you, Pervin. Thank you, Rochelle, for joining us and for your valuable insights. It's been a wonderful session. And thank you,
Thank
viewers, for
you.
being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Archana. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Pavan.